Imagine a world where the Renaissance happened 1,000 years early, until a single torch turned human progress into choking black smoke. Picture the city of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. The Mediterranean sun glints off pristine white marble, illuminating a skyline dominated by the Pharos Lighthouse, a structure so towering it was considered a wonder of the world. At its heart lies the Great Library, a silent, sprawling sanctuary containing the sum total of human wisdom. Here, scroll-lined walls hummed with the secrets of the cosmos, the mechanics of the stars, and the deepest mysteries of the human body. We are often told a tidy, tragic story, the myth that Julius Caesar, in a fit of tactical desperation during his siege of the city in 48 BC, accidentally reduced this beacon of civilization to ash. It is a story of a great man making a catastrophic mistake. But if you look closer, through the dust of the millennia, that narrative begins to fracture. If Caesar were truly the villain who erased the world's memory in one night of fire, how do we account for the records of scholars still working within its halls long after his ships had sailed? How did the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world survive his supposed wrath, only to vanish into the shadows of history centuries later? The truth is far more complex, and perhaps more chilling than a single accidental spark. The destruction of the library wasn't a singular event. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. To understand what was truly lost, we must move beyond the myth of the fire and peel back the layers of ancient politics, religious upheaval, and the calculated silence that followed. Something was systematically dismantled, and the culprits were not always who the history books would have us believe. We are standing at the threshold of a mystery, right? And by the end of this journey, you will realize that the fire was merely the final act in a much longer, darker play. Imagine stepping across the threshold of the Mausion, the house of the Muses. The air here is thick, not with the sweltering heat of the Egyptian sun, but with the dry, comforting scent of aged cedarwood and the faint metallic tang of ink. It is a sanctuary of silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic, steady scratching of reed pens against papyrus. This was the brain of the ancient world, a place where 1,000 scholars moved like ghosts through corridors lined with the collective intellect of humanity. In these halls, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with nothing more than a stick and the shadows of the sun, while Aristarchus dared to suggest that the world itself danced around the fire of the heavens. It was a dizzying era of enlightenment, right? Where the boundaries of what was known were pushed back daily. Here, knowledge was currency, and Alexandria was the wealthiest treasury on the map. Yet, this unparalleled brilliance was an anomaly. While the scholars within these walls dreamed of the stars and mapped the anatomy of the human spirit, the world outside was sharpening its blade. This concentration of absolute wisdom did not just inspire awe, it bred a profound, creeping fear. To the rising empires of the age, and to the dogmas that sought to command the masses, this library was a ticking time bomb of autonomy. How can you control a population that possesses the tools to think for itself? The more the library revealed about the mechanisms of the universe, the more it stripped away the mystery used by rulers to keep their subjects in line.
The prosperity of Alexandria made the city a target, but the knowledge inside, that made it a threat. As we look at the splendor of these white marbled halls, it is easy to assume they were always destined to fall to the torch. But the true erosion didn't start with a spark of fire. It started with the quiet, calculated realization that whoever controlled the contents of these shelves held the keys to reality itself. But there was one singular, fatal detail buried deep within the records of the Mausion, a discovery so volatile that it would eventually force the hand of those who feared the light of reason. What was the truth that the architects of the New World Order could not afford to let survive? The year is 48 BCE. The harbor of Alexandria, once the glittering jewel of the Mediterranean, has transformed into a suffocating forest of Roman masts, trapped in a desperate, relentless blockade. Julius Caesar, a man whose insatiable ambition has reshaped the very map of the known world, finds himself cornered. The Egyptian forces under the command of Ptolemy XIII are closing in, turning the harbor into a cage of iron and timber. To break the seal of that blockade, Caesar makes a decision that would haunt the collective memory of the ancient world. He commands his men to torch his own fleet. It is a tactical gamble born of pure, unadulterated desperation. As the oil and pitch catch, the inferno leaps from the ships to the crowded warehouses lining the docks. This is the moment history often marks as the grand tragedy, the night the world's knowledge burned. We are told, the legend insists, that the fire consumed the great library, sending the wisdom of centuries spiraling into the black Egyptian night in a column of smoke. But consider the geography of this catastrophe. The flames ravaged the harbor district, the storehouses and the docks, the logistical arteries of the city. Yet the great hill, the sacred precinct of the Mausean and the Serapeum, sat elevated and detached from the shoreline, protected by its stone foundations and the shared distance from that maritime conflagration. If the fire was merely a tactical disaster contained to the waterfront, then why does the legend persist that the library itself perished in the heat? The physical evidence suggests that the core collection, the scrolls that held the blueprints of ancient engineering and the lost secrets of the stars, remained untouched by Caesar's pyre. This leads us to an uncomfortable, haunting possibility. If the heart of the library survived the Roman fire, then the destruction we mourn was not a single unfortunate accident of war. It was a prolonged, methodical process. If Caesar's torch was not the final blow, we must ask ourselves, who were the real executioners waiting in the shadows? And more importantly, what were they trying to erase once the dust had finally settled? The ashes from the docks of Alexandria did not signify the end of the world's wisdom, as so many legends would have you believe. In reality, the heart of the great library proved far more resilient, much more resilient, than the iron-fisted ambitions of conquering armies. While the world wept for lost scrolls, the scholars of Egypt simply retreated to the shadows, preserving what remained of human understanding within the formidable walls of the Serapeum. This was the daughter library, a fortress of parchment and papyrus hidden away from the volatile, burning reach of the Roman Forum.
Even amidst the political instability that gripped the Mediterranean, the light of knowledge, it just refused to gutter out. We see the hand of Cleopatra, often painted by history as a tragic queen, acting as a fierce steward of this intellectual legacy. She did not merely rule, she restocked. Under her patronage, the library saw a renaissance of sorts, drawing the brightest minds to reorganize the remnants of the old collection and bridge the gaps left by the fires of war. This was not a dying institution, but a living, breathing organism that adapted to the shifting, violent tides of power. Subsequent Roman emperors, recognizing that to possess the library was to possess the mandate of the gods, continued to funnel resources into these hallowed halls. They understood, perhaps better than we do today, that a civilization is only as strong as its records. As long as the infrastructure held, as long as the ink flowed and the scribes remained, the glory of Greece and Egypt was tethered to the bedrock of reality. But as the century turned, the air began to change. The prosperity of the Pax Romana started to show its first hairline fractures, and the administrative machinery that sustained these scholars began to sputter, right? The political climate was cooling, and the golden age of open, global inquiry was slowly retreating into the sunset. It seems that while knowledge is difficult to kill, it is incredibly fragile when the hands of the state begin to tremble. We are left with a lingering, unsettling question. If the library survived the fires of Caesar, and it survived the turnover of regimes, why is it that so much of that ancient brilliance is still missing from our own history books? If the infrastructure was solid, truly solid, what specific, quiet catastrophe finally tore the pages from the shelves forever? The golden age of Alexandria was not extinguished in a single spectacular night of inferno. It was strangled by the slow, suffocating grip of shifting ideologies. As the Roman Empire transformed, its appetite for the classical world began to sour. The expansive, curious spirit that had once celebrated the wisdom of the Greeks and Egyptians found itself quite suddenly at odds with a new, state-mandated faith that demanded singular devotion. What was once a sanctuary of human achievement
housing the collective intellect of the Mediterranean, began to be viewed through a lens of profound suspicion. To the rising powers of the late Roman world, the scrolls of the library were no longer merely books. They were portals to a pagan past that needed to be severed. The air in Alexandria grew heavy with the tension of two worlds colliding, the ancient philosophical mind struggling to survive against a tide of militant orthodoxy. It was here that the chilling concept of damnatio memoriae took hold. This was not just destruction, it was a deliberate clinical erasure. It was the institutionalized belief that to secure the future, one must surgically remove the memory of the past. Statues were toppled, temples were stripped of their dignity, and the scrolls, those fragile vessels of mathematics, astronomy, and poetry, were suddenly cast as dangerous remnants of a forbidden, dark history.
Imagine the scene within those hallowed halls. The once bustling corridors, echoing with the debates of scholars, fell into a heavy, eerie silence. The librarians, the keepers of the flame, were no longer respected figures. They were increasingly seen as heretics clinging to ghosts. The very books that had mapped the stars and unlocked the secrets of geometry were now considered fuel for a fire that was not just physical, but ideological. But as the authorities began to view the library as a temple of heresy rather than a cathedral of knowledge, a more terrifying question emerges, right? Was the final destruction of the library an accident of war, or was it a state-sanctioned purge designed to reset the human story? Even more unsettling is the thought that the greatest threat to history wasn't the barbarian at the gate, but the ideology that deemed the truth itself to be an enemy of the state. Yet, there remains one final dark irony in this tragedy, an irony that suggests the true catastrophe wasn't the fire, but what was done to those who managed to escape the flames. The year is 391 AD, and the Mediterranean world stands at a terrifying precipice. For centuries, Alexandria had been the lighthouse of human knowledge, a sanctuary where the collective genius of the ancient world was stored in papyrus and ink. But now, that light is being systematically extinguished. Emperor Theodosius has issued a decree that ripples through the empire like a death knell, the Edict of Thessalonica. With a single stroke of a pen, he has effectively outlawed the old ways, transforming the pursuit of Hellenistic philosophy into an act of sedition. The air in Alexandria grows thick with the dust of zealotry. The focus of the state's wrath is the Serapeum, the daughter library of the Great Library. You see, this isn't the chaotic destruction of a battlefield or the accidental blaze of a general's torch. This is an act of organized, cold-blooded erasure. Listen closely to the past, and you can almost hear the rhythm of the apocalypse. It is the rhythmic, sickening crunch of iron hammers meeting sacred marble. Mobs, emboldened by the imperial decree, surge through the streets. They aren't merely looking for gold or conquest, right? No, they are hunting ideas. They tear into the hallowed halls, indifferent to the treasures housed within. Priceless scrolls, the recorded observations of mathematicians who charted the heavens, the medical breakthroughs of anatomists who dared to map the human body, the maps of distant lands, are treated as nothing more than kindling. They are snatched from their shelves and tossed onto the cobblestones like refuse, destined to feed a bonfire of intolerance. It is a systematic dismantling of the ancient mind. As the scrolls burn, the smoke rises, carrying with it the blueprints of a civilization that was arguably a millennium ahead of its time. But here is the question that haunts every historian who gazes upon these ruins. What exactly was lost in that specific targeted raid? We know the names of the lost plays, the missing scrolls of Aristarchus, the astronomical charts that predicted the cosmos. But consider the deeper void. Truly consider it. What mathematical proofs were incinerated that could have bridged the gap between ancient engineering and the Industrial Revolution? What medical knowledge was turned to ash that might have spared the world centuries of plague and suffering?
The fire was not merely a physical catastrophe. It was the start of a long, dark silence in the history of science.
Yet, as we sift through the charred remains of our own past, we find that the fire in the Serapeum was only the beginning of a much larger, more calculated conspiracy of silence. Because there was one secret, a piece of evidence hidden in the heart of the archives that the rioters were desperate to find before the flames consumed it entirely. And what they did to the keepers of those secrets is even more chilling than the destruction of the books themselves. The year is 415 AD. The once great metropolis of Alexandria, the true crown jewel of the Mediterranean, has become a powder keg of religious fervor and political bloodletting. And standing in the very center of this storm, with the weight of centuries of human knowledge resting upon her shoulders, is Hypatia. She was not merely a librarian or a philosopher, you know. She was the last living link to the intellectual brilliance of the Greeks, a woman who taught mathematics, astronomy, and the lost arts of the ancients to anyone with the courage to listen. But in an era where the shadow of ignorance was rapidly eclipsing the light of reason, such brilliance was viewed as a dangerous threat. The mob, whipped into a frenzy by local ecclesiastical power brokers, did not just want to burn the scrolls. They wanted to extinguish the mind that understood them. As Hypatia traveled through the streets in her chariot, the silence of the city was shattered. A group of men, driven by the belief that her influence over the city's political leaders was an affront to their new order, dragged her from her carriage. They did not take her to a court of law. They took her to the Caesareum, a former temple. There, amid the echoing halls that once held the whispers of scholars, they stripped her of her robes, using sharp roof tiles as their blades, a final grotesque insult to the tools of her trade. They tore the life from her. It was a cold, calculated act of erasure. Her death was not just the murder of a woman, it was the symbolic execution of classical antiquity. As she fell to the cold stone floor, the last real shield protecting the secrets of the ancient world shattered. With the primary custodian of the archives gone, the remaining keepers fled, and the library, already a hollow shell of its former glory, was left to the mercy of the flames and the encroaching desert sands. The lights of the ancient world were blinking out one by one, leaving us in a darkness that would last for centuries. But even as her blood stained the earth, there were those who believed a select few of her most profound manuscripts had been spirited away into the night by a handful of devoted students. If the library was truly destroyed, then where did these missing scrolls go? And why, even today, do archaeologists find mysterious recurring references to a hidden collection that supposedly survived the purge? The smoke finally cleared over the harbor, revealing not the cradle of human genius, but a hollowed-out skeleton of stone. Where scholars once walked beneath colonnades of marble to debate the movements of the planets, the silence was now absolute, almost heavy. The grand halls, once fragrant with cedar oil and the scent of aging parchment, were reduced to damp stables for scavenger animals, their floors littered with the ash of 1,000,000 lost ideas.
We often look back at the collapse of the classical world as a slow, inevitable decline, a natural fade into the shadows. But the truth is far more violent. When those shelves were emptied, humanity didn't just lose history, we lost our momentum. Consider the sheer scale of the void. We know of the plays of Sophocles, those towering pillars of dramatic art, but most remain forever unreachable, reduced to charcoal. We know of the brilliance of Aristarchus, who calculated that the earth revolved around the sun over 1,000 years before Copernicus, yet his proofs were treated as mere kindling. There are accounts of mechanical marvels, prototypes for steam-driven devices, and complex gear-driven calculators that could have sparked an industrial revolution in the ancient world. They weren't just forgotten.
they were incinerated. The so-called Dark Ages were not a natural regression. They were the direct, tragic consequence of this systemic purge. When the repository of our species' knowledge was extinguished, the light of inquiry flickered out with it. We were thrust into a centuries-long fog, left to reinvent the wheel, the compass, and the lens, all while staring at the ruins of a golden age we could no longer comprehend. But here is where the narrative takes a haunting turn, right? If the library was a singular point of failure, why do some fragments of these lost technologies seem to reappear in the most unlikely of places, centuries later? It suggests that while the building burned, the knowledge might have escaped through the back doors of history. If the library was merely a symptom of a much larger global suppression of the truth, then what were the true architects of this dark age so desperate to keep us from finding? For centuries, we have been fed a convenient lie. We point our fingers at Julius Caesar, envisioning his ships ablaze in the harbor, the flames leaping from the docks to the papyrus scrolls of the great library. It is a dramatic, cinematic end, the kind of tragedy that fits so neatly into a history book, right? But it is precisely this simplicity that should make us suspicious. Why does the weight of a world-altering tragedy fall so perfectly on the shoulders of one man, a dead general who cannot defend his legacy? The truth is far more unsettling. By pinning the destruction of the Library of Alexandria on an accidental fire during a Roman power struggle, later chroniclers and religious authorities effectively silenced the deeper, more uncomfortable reality. The library didn't just vanish in a single explosive moment. It was dismantled by the slow, systematic rot of state-sponsored intolerance and bureaucratic neglect. History is a weapon, and it is almost always written by those who survive the collapse. For the institutions rising in the wake of the classical world, acknowledging the intellectual brilliance of the past was dangerous. I mean, think about it. To admit that the library was a victim of a coordinated campaign against pagan knowledge would have been to admit to a cultural arson. It was far safer to transform Caesar into a convenient scapegoat, turning a calculated eradication of history into a mere casualty of war. Consider the timing. By the time the final embers cooled, the philosophical foundations of the ancient world had been deemed heretical. If we accept the myth that the fire was an accident, we absolve the true architects of the ensuing Dark Age from their responsibility. We let them off the hook for the systematic censorship that turned the Mediterranean from a hub of scientific discovery into a landscape of dogma.
We have been conditioned to look for a singular culprit, a specific date, or a single villain, all while ignoring the slow-moving storm of cultural erasure that happened right under the noses of those who lived through it. But if the destruction was not a one-time event, but rather a long, premeditated dismantling of human progress, then we have to ask ourselves, who stood to gain the most from the silence? The answer isn't buried under a pile of ash in the harbor. It is hidden in the very documents that were allowed to survive, and in the patterns of information that were suddenly and suspiciously omitted from the record forever. Yet, even as we peel back these layers, there is a much deeper enigma lurking beneath the surface, a secret that suggests the library wasn't just destroyed to hide information, but to bury a truth that was never meant to be rediscovered. As we stand amidst the sunken ruins of the Pharos and the silent, salt-sprayed echoes of the Serapeum, the truth becomes painfully clear. The tragedy of Alexandria was not merely a singular moment of flame and fury. It was the quiet, agonizing process of being forgotten. We gaze upon the empty horizon of the Mediterranean and realize that the library did not just burn, it was erased from the collective memory of mankind, leaving behind a silence that lasted for over 1,000 years. You know,
We are the survivors of a dark age that need never have happened. We walk the halls of our modern world, built upon foundations of steel and silicon, yet we are haunted by the ghosts of books we will never read, the mathematics we failed to learn, and the lost histories of stars that burned out long before we ever turned our eyes to the sky. The loss of Alexandria serves as a brutal reminder that knowledge is not a permanent fixture of the human condition. It is a fragile flame, easily snuffed out by the winds of ignorance, apathy, and the short-sighted ambitions of those who would see the world burn to secure their own transient power. But look around you. Our modern digital repositories, our archives, and our vast interconnected networks are just as fragile as those ancient scrolls of papyrus, right? I mean, we live in an era of information, yet we are increasingly susceptible to the same erosion of history that claimed the treasures of the Ptolemies. History is not a static monolith. It is a living, breathing responsibility. If we do not hold the light high, the shadows will eventually reclaim everything we have built. The fire of the past is still glowing in the embers of what remains. If you find yourself wondering what other secrets have been buried by the sands of time, or if you feel the weight of these lost centuries, then join us on this journey. Subscribe to Hidden Epoch Narratives to ensure that the fire of history is never extinguished again. What lost piece of ancient wisdom do you wish we could recover today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let us keep the memory of the light alive.